Morning, everyone. Welcome to another daily devotional. Today, we're going to move into the next small section of Philippians chapter 3. We're going to look at verses 4 to 9. The Bible clearly teaches, as we all know, that heaven and hell are real places. It also teaches that when every one of us die, we're going to go to one of those two places. Now, imagine if I went out and did a survey in a local city and stopped people and asked them about whether they wanted to go to heaven or hell, assuming that they believed in heaven and hell. And I said, would you want, when you die, to go to hell? I would imagine that the vast majority of people would probably say no. If I asked the question, if when you die, would you want to go to heaven? I would imagine that likewise, the vast majority of people would say yes. And if I was to follow that up with another question and say, do you think God will let you into heaven when you die? Again, the vast majority of people will probably say yes. And if I were to further ask the question, why do you think God would let you into heaven? Probably most people would answer in some way or another along the lines of, because of the sort of person I am, I'm a good person, I try my best, I do try to help others and so on. So on the basis of who they are and maybe what they do, they maybe say, well, I go to church or I give money to charity. So on the basis of who they are and what they do and what their background is, they expect to go to heaven. The Apostle Paul, prior to his personal encounter with the Lord Jesus Christ on the road to Damascus, and his consequent conversion, Paul believed that when he died, he was going to heaven. And he believed he was going to heaven because of who he was, because of his background, because of the way he lived his life, because of the special status that he believed he had with God. All of these things were part and parcel of why Paul thought he was going to heaven. And in verses 5 to 7 of this third chapter of Philippians, Paul details for us all the things that he thought guaranteed him a place in heaven. But as we're going to see, Saul's hope of heaven boiled down to this: because of who I am, because of the sort of person I am, I'm confident I'm going to heaven. Paul's problem, of course, was that whilst he thought he was on the road that led to heaven, the fact of the matter was that he was on the road that would ultimately lead him to hell. Paul didn't realise, but he was depending on his own goodness to get him to heaven. And the Bible tells us that all our righteousness, all our personal goodness, all the things about us that we think are good, those good things, never mind our bad things, those good things in the eyes of God are like filthy, stinking rags. Thankfully, Paul met Jesus on the Damascus road and he came to realise that all his own righteousness was like filthy rags, and he turned to Christ. So, as we look at this morning, I want us to see the self-righteousness that Paul renounced. He was saying to the Philippians in the verses we looked at last few days, watch out for false teachers. And the false teaching was, Jesus isn't enough. You have to have something else. And the something else in this case was, you have to have circumcision and you have to obey all the laws that Moses gave us. So the Apostle Paul not only warns the Philippians about this, he also speaks from his own personal experience. He says, if there was anybody who could be guaranteed a place in heaven because of their background, because of being circumcised, because of keeping the law, it was me. But all those things were no good. Let's start and look at these things that he details for us in the verses before us this morning. First of all, before Paul was converted, he was looking to and depending on his covenant status. Look at what he says. He says, I was circumcised on the 8th day, or more literally, as for circumcision, an 8th day. So in other words, Paul had not only received the sign that incorporated him into the people of God here on earth, but he had received the sign in strict compliance with the law of God on the 8th day after his birth. He wasn't incorporated into the covenant community as a proselyte, somebody who came to be part of the Jewish community later in life. No, he had full credentials. His parents made sure he was circumcised on the 8th day. And from a very early age, Paul was part of the visible community of God's people. Now, I want to stop and just apply that before we come to a close in our study this morning. There are many people today who are just like Paul was. They think that because they were baptized as a baby, because their parents belonged to a church and they as a child were baptized into that church, and in being baptized into that church became part of the visible community of God's people on earth, that guarantees them a place in heaven. This is part of the teaching of certain churches like Roman Catholicism or even Anglicanism to a certain extent, where they teach that a child, when he or she is baptized, is born again through baptism. And children growing up believe that because they were baptized and because their mummy and daddy are churchgoers and that they themselves are part of the visible church, that they are guaranteed a place in heaven. Friends, water being thrown over you, whether when you're a baby or when you're an adult, doesn't make you a Christian. The fact that you belong to and grew up in a family that was church going, that belonged to the visible people of God, doesn't mean you're going to heaven. Paul had impeccable credentials when it came to this, but the fact that he was circumcised the 8th day wasn't going to get him into heaven. The fact that you were christened, baptized, whatever, doesn't guarantee that you're going to heaven. The only thing that guarantees that we'll go to heaven is personal faith in the Lord Jesus Christ. We're going to see that as we work our way through these studies over the next few days. So whilst, yes, as a Presbyterian, I believe it is completely biblical for us to baptize our children and to incorporate them within the visible church of Christ on earth, the visible people of God, nevertheless, that in and of itself does not guarantee that that child, or as a child grows up, that adult will go to heaven. May God write these things upon our hearts and teach us from them today. Have a good day, folks, and have a good weekend.